When I started in journalism, the internet has been around for 15 years. I was covering the Arab Spring, engulfing Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. Really using social media. And I was helping to produce a nightly news show, PBS NewsHour. When the small town of Libya was being shelled by Gaddafi forces, I used social media to locate a professor there, hunkered down in his house, afraid for his life, but he was willing to share his story. We couldn't identify his identity, but his story was gripping. It felt powerful and important. And in a very small way, it felt like a pinnacle of my journalism career. Here I was, a girl from Kazakhstan who used to sell shock absorbers out of her mom's apartment, covering the biggest international story of the world, really, for the American news show. But then weeks passed, and I kept thinking about that professor. What happened to him? Was he okay? I tried to get in touch, to no avail. And then when I started working for a local newspaper here in Pittsburgh, I realized what was missing in that story, and that is I wasn't really the stakeholder of the Zawiya story. You know, I was with a show, we moved with the news cycle, new countries, new social media connections. And what was I really doing? Was I holding Muammar Gaddafi accountable, the Libya dictator? As powerful as PBS is, I'm sure he didn't care. And that's the world we're in, right? From the streets of Pittsburgh to the penthouses of Paris, everybody with internet connection can get access to all human knowledge available on the web. And then the curators of that information also have different understandings of what those responsibilities are. You know, who decides what's fit to print on the web, what's fit to publish? Everyone. Who's holding anyone accountable? No one, really. And here we are in the world where the newspapers have been disappearing and their business models have been eroding. In the past 40 years, 25% of the newspapers have completely disappeared. The newsroom staff have been cut. In 2017, the newspaper reporter has been determined to be the worst job to have, worse than a lumberjack or a pest control worker. But in all of these, pursuit of clicks, clickbait, listicles, meaningless stories, speed, we forgot that the production of public service journalism is really important for our society. The type of public service journalism that Thomas Jefferson had said he would prefer in the absence of government, rather than vice versa. Instead, what we feed our readers are, what Morgan Spurlock fed his stomach. You have, the body politic really suffers on a steady diet of water-skinned squirrels and propaganda. But what is journalism? Why do we need it? Why is it so important? Why is the free press enshrined in the First Amendment? It is about truth. Why truth is important? Well, democracy depends on truth. Because without truth, we don't have trust. Without trust, we don't have the rule of law. And without the rule of law, we don't have democracy. Historian Timothy Snyder said it eloquently. And another thing is that journalism is really public service journalism. It is supposed to serve the public, to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, to rock the boat, to shake the status quo. What do you think when I say journalism? You're probably thinking of this, names, Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Anderson Cooper. You might be thinking of big names like the New York Times, Fox News, NPR. Or you might be thinking of these guys, Jon Stewart, Trevor Noah, and John Oliver with his beautiful British accent. But these are national, big organizations that are not really in trouble. They're called fake news, but good journalism is being produced in America, and we see it every day. What is really in trouble is local news. Don't take my word for it. I don't know how the editor of the New York Times got hold of my slides, but he did say this week that the biggest crisis in American journalism is local news. I couldn't verify if the Russians were involved. But then, what do you think of when I say local news? You're probably thinking of big, channels. You're thinking of the local newspaper. You're thinking of the radio stations. Or you might be thinking of this guy, right? Ron Burgundy. We like to laugh at local news, but no wonder, right? Because is it public service to know the 3 ways the Steelers can win the game? Is it public service to know that 6 ways elk mating gets Pennsylvania going? Or 7 restaurants you had no idea existed in your city? Well, that's not really public service. But public service journalism is important to the fulfillment of the dream that we have as the city, to take us to the next level. Because as the city, we need journalism that actually tells us, how could we do better? How could we become the society we really want to be? Pittsburgh for all, the city for all, the kind that our mayor likes to talk about. Well, and then there are the stories like this. Public service to talk for a week about catfish. I'm a Penguins fan, by the way. Then we have stories like this about power outages, the stories that that live for 15 minutes. Then you have stories like where you can find the cheapest gas. Or you can see, endless weather stories that just consume us, and we hear again and again who gets to report the first raindrops first. But then, you hear, well, maybe that's what people want. This is what people want. We give them what they want. But is it really what they want? We asked a few people, what do you want from local news? What they say is, I want stories that relate to me. I want the story with accurate information. I want stories that cover inconvenient topics. Unsatisfied by trivialities, I want depth. So what's the solution? The internet has given us a lot of powerful tools, but it also has, disintegrated the fabric that used to rely on newspapers. And I think that the solution does not lie on the legacy news organizations that have been there and not fulfilling the purpose of public service journalism, making it survive, although they do try to do that work. But it becomes harder and harder. The future of public service journalism lies in smaller, non-profit newsrooms that believe that that type of journalism is important for the communities that we want to live in. As Clay Shirky said, society doesn't need newspapers. What we need is journalism. Let me ask you, what kind of society do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a society that is diverse, that is informed, that is comfortable in taking a closer look at what's wrong and how we can fix it? Or do you want to live in a society that is scared, lives in its own online bubbles, that is alienating important members of the community? I hope you believe that you want to live in a society that is the former. So that's where public service journalism is really important. Because what do we do? What does public service journalism do? it gives voice to the voiceless. It covers stories that are not about just, a shooting happened, a man got shot, but it looks into, that 50% of murders in Pittsburgh in 2016 were not solved, and Cassidy's mom is one of them, and it's important to tell his story. It's the story like Monet Spencer, who has been homeless and really an orphan, and she finds resilience and strength in fulfilling her dreams of pursuing education. It's journalism that covers voices like Gary Reeves, who has been a victim of gentrification and has been, when his story is told, feels very grateful for it. It's the stories that drive change, that tells us what's wrong with our education, with our perception, that the stories that educate our teachers on how to be better at what they do. It's the stories that serve you as a watchdog, to tell you how your tax money is being spent. It's the stories that give you tools that teach you how to use publicly available records to be an active and engaged citizen. There are organizations that support that type of journalism, public service journalism, journalism that sees its mission for public good. There are a lot of foundations locally and nationally who have been advocates and supporters of that type of journalism, and we are eternally grateful for that support. But there is also an important component, and that is you. So what can you do? What can you do to empower public service journalism? Well, first of all, reward good journalism. It's really important that you read it, right? And it's really important that if you have young people in your life, you teach them what kind of stories are meaningful stories. You also, with so much choice on the web, it's also important for you to make your choices deliberate, because it's an opportunity cost. When you're reading meaningless stories, you're not reading stories that are important to your community. Well, also, you should use your brain, use your critical thinking. See, is it an opinion piece that you're reading? Is it a news report? Is it a breaking news story? Is it actually a story that relies on good sourcing and has gone through a thorough fact check? And also, see who's quoted in those stories. You would actually be surprised in how many times you'll see just men being quoted in those stories. It happens quite often in Pittsburgh. And also, hold media companies accountable. If you're not satisfied with the type of reporting they're doing, call them out on it. Write letters to the editor, comment, call the editor. And get to know your journalists that cover your community and the issues that you care about. They're people too. And speak up, be heard. If you feel like there is a story that is not being covered right now, talk about it. Find news organizations that actually will find that your story is important to be told and will tell it. And support good journalism. All of those hours of fact-checking and finding good stories and including all of these sources, it costs money, so support good journalism. And lastly, I'm an optimist that that public service journalism is going to survive, and it's going to thrive as we are figuring out what the future of journalism looks like. I also am not going back to Washington, D.C. to cover Libya stories. I am the stakeholder in Pittsburgh's success, and it's my home. And I hope that all of these moments and stories that matter to Pittsburgh, that Monet Spencer story, of her being able to fulfill her dream, or that Gary Reeves story, of him being able to speak up and get his voice heard, they're all important, but they're just moments. We need to make public service journalism a movement. Please, help us make it a movement. Help us speak truth to power Pittsburgh. Thank you.